All right, chapter 4.2. All right, we're going to talk about triangles being congruent and figures being congruent. All right, so let's talk about what that means. If we have congruent figures, if we have two figures or three figures or however many figures and they are congruent, that means that they are the same size and the same shape. In order to be congruent, they've got to be the same size and the same shape. All right? Okay. One thing that we're really going to have to understand is what are corresponding parts. Last chapter we talked about corresponding angles, and we said that they were angles in the same position. Right? Corresponding parts are kind of the same thing. Right? So let's draw two congruent triangles. Right? We've got those two triangles. I'm going to label them ABC and XYZ. Right. Corresponding parts. If these two triangles are congruent, right, if they are congruent, then their parts, they have corresponding parts that are congruent. For instance, angle A would correspond to angle X because they would have to be congruent. So angle A and angle X are corresponding angles, corresponding parts. Right. Angle B would correspond with angle Y because they would be congruent. Then angle C would correspond with angle Z. All right? Now, corresponding parts aren't just angles. Right? They're angles and sides. Right, so we've got the corresponding angles. Now we have corresponding sides also. Okay? Side AB would correspond with side XY, and they would be congruent. Side BC would correspond with side YZ, and they would be congruent. Side AC would correspond with side XZ, so they would be congruent. All right, so all these parts, all of these corresponding parts are congruent to each other. All right, and the way that we use this is when we want to write what is called a congruence statement. Right? If I want to write a congruence statement or a statement of congruence, which is all I'm going to do to write this is to say that this triangle is congruent to this triangle. The way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to have to match up my corresponding parts. All right, so let's look and see what that means. If I want to call this triangle, let's say I'm going to call it triangle ABC. Okay? Triangle ABC. And I want to say that it is congruent to this triangle. We're going to have to match up the corresponding parts. So since I put A first when naming this triangle, I'm going to have to put its corresponding angle, which is X, first. Okay? And then angle B, I put it next, and it corresponds to angle Y, so I'm going to have to put Y next. And then C corresponds with Z. Alright? So the order that we name our figures is important because we've got to match up the corresponding parts. Right? If I would have named this triangle, let's say I would have named it BCA. Right? I couldn't say that triangle BCA is congruent to XYZ because B does not correspond to X. We've got to match the corresponding parts. So B, since B corresponds with Y, we'd have to put Y first. C corresponds with Z, so I'd have to put Z next. And then A corresponds with X. Right? So both of these are acceptable congruent statements. Okay? If when you are asked to write a congruent statement, that's what you're going to do. But you have to match up your corresponding parts. All right? Because this shows you, if we didn't pretend that we didn't have these pictures, right, and we just had the statements, by this statement I could see that A is congruent to X, B is congruent to Y, C is congruent to Z, without even having a picture. Okay? I could also say that AB, side AB, is congruent to side XY. I could see that BC is congruent to YZ, and AC is congruent to XZ. Right? Without even having a picture. That's why we need to match up our corresponding parts for a congruent statement. All right? So here is an example that you need. All right? I'm going to draw these two quadrilaterals. That one. And this one. All right? And we're going to pretend that they are congruent. I'm going to label this one ABCD. This one is EFGH. Right? I'm going to let you draw that. All right? Okay. And we're going to say that ABCD, okay, this figure, is congruent to GHEF. Okay? Right? And there's some other things that we know about this. AB is 8 feet. CD is 12 feet. Angle A is 102 degrees. Angle D is 84 degrees. Angle C is 68 degrees. Side EF is 2x minus 4 feet. Angle E is 6y plus x degrees. Alright? What we are going to do is solve for x and y. Alright? So, according to our congruent statement down here, I'm going to label my two shapes, my two figures, so that I can just look at these and stop having to look at my statement every time. Okay? So A corresponds to G, so I know that A is congruent to G. I know that B and H are congruent. B, H. I know that C and E are congruent. And I know that D and F are congruent. Right? Also, I know that AB is congruent to GH. I know that BC is congruent to HE. I know that CD is congruent to EF. And I know that AD is congruent to FG. Right? So now I've got everything labeled. I know what's congruent to what, and that's going to help me solve for X and Y. Now, when I look at this, I need to ask myself, should I solve for X first or Y first? Right? By looking at the information we have, I would say that we need to solve for X first, because in this expression right here, X, there's just one variable. In this one, we've got an X and a Y. Right? So if we can solve for X, then we can plug it in here and solve for Y. So let's look at 2X minus 4. We know that this side, EF, corresponds to CD. So we know that 12 equals 2x minus 4, because those two sides are congruent to each other. Right? So then we solve, and we get x equals 8. Right? One down. Now we got to solve for y. Okay? Now that we know that x equals 8, in place of x, I can make that an 8. Okay? And now, let's look and find angle E corresponds to what angle? Corresponds to angle C. So we know that since they correspond, they've got to be congruent. So we can say that 68 degrees equals 6y plus 8. Okay? Because that angle equals that angle. So now we can solve. 60 equals 6y. So y equals 10. Okay? Alright, we've got one more theorem. Okay? Theorem 4.3. It's called the third angles theorem. Right? The third angles theorem says that if we have two triangles, we got those two triangles. It says that if two of the pairs are congruent, let's say A and Y are congruent, and B and X are congruent. Okay? If you have two pair of congruent angles, then the third pair has to be congruent. That's what our third angles theorem says. It says if angle A is congruent to angle Y and angle B is congruent to angle X. Okay? If we have two pair of congruent angles, then angle C must be congruent to angle Z. The third pair has to be, because every triangle adds up to 180 degrees. Okay? Every triangle adds up to 180 degrees. All right, here's our last example for the 4.2. Okay. We got that right there. Okay? And what we want to do is we want to find the measure of WXY. Okay? The second thing is that the measure of angle XYZ is 4p plus 5. P is just a variable here. Okay? So we're going to also have to find the value of P. Alright? So let's look at some information that we've got. We know that W and Z are congruent. We also know that these two angles are congruent. Okay. We know that this angle is 35 degrees and this angle is 40 degrees. Okay, so we've got all that information. Right? So to solve for WXY, we're going to have to find the measures of different angles first before we just find WXY. Okay, so when you look at this picture, I want you to see how many triangles are there. I hope you said 5. Some of you probably said 3 or 2 or something, but there should be 5. All right, we've got this triangle 1, this triangle 2, this triangle 3, that triangle 4, that triangle 5. Okay, 5 triangles. All right, so let's look. We know that these two angles are congruent, so we can say that this angle is 40 degrees. We also know that these two angles are congruent, so we can say that that one is 35 degrees. Okay? Now, if we just look at this triangle right here, the little one in the middle, if we just look at that one and forget about those two, just look at that triangle, okay? We know that every triangle adds up to 180 degrees. So for this triangle right here, we know that 35 plus 35 plus whatever that angle is equals 180. So let's find the measure of that angle. Say 70 plus whatever that is equals 180 minus 70 minus 70. Okay? So we know that the measure of this angle is 110 degrees. Okay? Now, with that, can we find the measure of any other angle? Right? Well, you should notice that this makes an X right here. Okay, so we could look at the vertical angles, but this isn't an angle in the triangles. But what do you notice about those two angles right there, 110 and that angle? Okay, they're a linear pair, which means they are supplementary. See how they make a straight line? So they're going to add to 180. So to find this angle, we're going to say 180 minus 110, which is 70. So that tells us that this angle is 70 degrees. Okay? Then, look at our X. We know that these two angles are vertical angles. And vertical angles are congruent. So this angle is 70 degrees. Also, because these are vertical. Okay? Now look, we've got this triangle right here. We're going to forget about these triangles and just look at that one. All triangles add up to 180. We've got two angles, 70 and 40. So we can find this other angle. Right? We can say that this angle plus 40 plus 70 equals 180. Okay. Again, we're just looking at that triangle right there. So now we can solve and find the measure of this angle. So this would be 110. So when we subtract, again we would get that this is 70 degrees. All right? which would mean this one is 70 degrees. Okay? So we just found the measure of every angle in this drawing. And we had to do that in order to find what we're looking for, which is W, X, Y. Okay? We're looking for this angle right here. So the measure of that angle would be 70 plus 35, which would be 105 degrees. Okay? So, we just found that one. Now, let's look at XYZ. XYZ. We know that that angle is also 105 degrees. So in place of this, we could put 105. Say 105 equals 4P plus 5. Again, P is just a variable, like X, Y, Z, or anything. Okay? And we just need to solve for P, minus 5. 5 by 4. So P equals 25. Right? And we solve for both of them. What you're going to see as we continue on is that you're going to have to do things like this. See how we had to solve for different angles that it didn't ask us to solve for? But we had to solve for the other ones in order to find what we were asked to find. Right? So a lot of times you're not going to be able to just find just what you need for the problem. You're going to have to find other things that will help you find that. Right? Okay, that was 4.2. You can find your homework on Renwheel.